If you're over 60, you may have heard warnings about blood clots that sound sudden and dramatic. A clot that came out of nowhere. A stroke or heart attack that no one saw coming. What is far less talked about is how quietly clot risk often builds over time. Not from a single mistake, not from one bad meal, but from everyday patterns that slowly change how blood behaves inside aging vessels. Cardiologists who work with older adults see this repeatedly. Blood clots rarely form in isolation. They emerge when inflammation, vessel health, metabolism, and coagulation drift out of balance, sometimes over years. And diet plays a role in that balance, not as an acute trigger, but as a long-term influence on how thick, reactive, and resilient the blood becomes. To understand why this matters after 60, it helps to start with what changes inside the body as we age. As the years pass, blood vessels naturally become stiffer. The inner lining of the arteries, the endothelium, loses some of its ability to regulate dilation and repair. At the same time, low-grade inflammation becomes more common, even in people who feel generally well. The body's natural system for dissolving small clots, fibrinolysis, also becomes less efficient. That means clots are not only more likely to form, but harder to break down once they do. Add common conditions like insulin resistance, type 2 diabetes, or atrial fibrillation, and the blood environment becomes even more prothrombotic. Fibrinogen levels rise. Platelets become more reactive. The structure of clots becomes denser and more resistant to breakdown. None of this happens overnight. It happens quietly. This is why cardiologists are careful with the word cause. No single food causes a blood clot, but certain dietary patterns can push the system in the wrong direction, especially in older adults whose margins are already narrower. One of the most important of those patterns involves saturated fat. Risk number 1, diets consistently high in saturated fat. Saturated fat does more than affect cholesterol. In older adults, it also affects how blood vessels function and how efficiently clots are cleared. Intervention studies have shown that diets high in saturated fat impair endothelial function. More importantly, for clot risk, they reduce the ability of blood vessels to release tissue plasminogen activator, TPA, a key enzyme involved in breaking down clots. In one controlled study, adults consuming a diet high in saturated fat had about a 30% reduction in endothelial fibrinolytic capacity compared with those eating lower fat patterns. That means clots that form are cleared more slowly. Over time, this creates what cardiologists sometimes describe as stickier blood. Not because blood suddenly thickens, but because the balance between clot formation and clot breakdown shifts. Foods that contribute most strongly to this pattern are not rare or exotic. They are everyday items eaten frequently. Fattier cuts of meat, processed meats, high-fat cheeses, butter-heavy prepared foods. The issue is not occasional intake. It is habitual consumption in a body that already has reduced vascular resilience. Risk number 2, regular consumption of processed and red meat. The relationship between red meat and blood clots is complex. Large studies do not consistently show a strong direct link to venous thrombosis alone. However, for arterial clot risk, the kind involved in heart attacks and many strokes, the picture is clearer. Prospective studies in older adults show that higher intake of red and processed meat is associated with increased risk of atherosclerotic cardiovascular events. One reason involves inflammation and lipid metabolism. Another involves gut-derived metabolites such as TMAO, which have been shown to increase platelet reactivity and thrombosis potential. Processed meats add another layer of concern. They are often high in saturated fat, sodium, and compounds formed during processing that promote oxidative stress. All of these contribute to endothelial dysfunction over time. For seniors with existing atherosclerosis, coronary artery disease, or atrial fibrillation, this matters more. the blood is already closer to a proclotting state. Frequent processed meat consumption nudges it further. Again, cardiologists are not warning against a single meal. They are warning about patterns that repeat week after week. Risk number 3, high glycemic, sugar-rich foods that stress the clotting system. Another quiet contributor to clot risk is how the body handles sugar after meals. Highly refined carbohydrates and sugary foods cause rapid spikes in blood glucose and insulin. In younger adults, the system often recovers quickly. After 60, recovery is slower. Repeated glucose spikes increase oxidative stress and impair endothelial function. They also alter clot structure. Research in people with diabetes and insulin resistance shows higher fibrinogen levels, increased thrombin generation, and denser fibrin networks that resist breakdown. This means clots formed after years of poor glucose control are not only more likely, but harder to dissolve. Cohort studies link dietary patterns high in refined grains, sweets, and sugary beverages with higher inflammatory markers such as CRP and fibrinogen, both associated with higher clot risk. Common examples include sweetened breakfast cereals, white bread pastries, desserts, and sugar-sweetened drinks consumed daily. The danger is not sugar itself. It is chronic metabolic stress layered onto aging vessels. Risk number 4, highly processed Western eating patterns. When cardiologists step back and look at overall risk, they rarely focus on one food. They look at patterns. Western dietary patterns, high in saturated fat, processed meat, refined carbohydrates, and low in fiber and plant foods, are consistently associated with worse inflammatory and coagulation profiles in older adults. Studies show higher levels of fibrinogen, factor VII activity, and inflammatory markers in people following these patterns. At the same time, markers of vascular health and fibrinolysis decline. By contrast, Mediterranean and DASH-style patterns, rich in vegetables, fruits, whole grains, legumes, fish, nuts, and unsaturated fats, are associated with lower inflammation and more favorable hemostatic profiles. This does not mean such diets thin the blood like medication. It means they support the systems that prevent unnecessary clot formation in the first place. What a cardiologist's warning actually means. When cardiologists warn older adults about food and clot risk, they are not issuing bans. They are describing risk layering. A person over 60 may already have stiffer arteries. They may have slower fibrinolysis. They may be on medications that affect platelets or coagulation. In that context, daily consumption of saturated fat-heavy, sugar-rich, highly processed foods adds friction to an already stressed system. The warning is about frequency and accumulation, not fear. From a clinical perspective, the most protective changes are also the least dramatic. Reducing portion size and frequency of processed meats. Choosing leaner proteins more often. Replacing refined carbohydrates with whole grains. Increasing fiber-rich plant foods that reduce inflammation and improve metabolic control. Hydration and regular movement also matter, especially for venous circulation. So does managing blood pressure, glucose, and lipid levels. Food does not act alone. It acts within a system. The key message for older adults is this: blood clots are rarely sudden accidents. They are the result of years of small shifts in vascular health, metabolism, and inflammation. No single food causes a clot, but certain patterns quietly raise the odds. The earlier those patterns are recognized, the more room there is to reverse course, calmly, deliberately, and without extremes. That is what cardiologists mean when they warn. Not panic, not prohibition, but awareness of how everyday choices shape the blood long before a clot ever forms.